Hello.
Hi, Lisa.
So, are we live?
I think we're live, yes.
Good afternoon, or morning, or evening, depending upon where you are in the universe, since we are online. My name is Lisa Steele. I'm the creative director at Vtape, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everyone to this conversation. Vtape is hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee, which has bound them to share the territory and protect the land. That bound them to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations, Métis and the Inuit peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect, and we thank them for it. I welcome Adam Barbu and John Ricco back to continue a conversation that began in 2019 during Adam's exhibition, Empty, which featured artworks by Deirdre Logue, Lucas Michael, and Paul Wong. It's a wonderful exhibition, and there is a short video you may have watched. If after this conversation you want to see the artworks, please continue to look at it. It's on the Vtape website. So I'll turn this over to you, Adam.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. I'd like to just first thank Vtape for hosting this conversation and for continuing to support progressive conversations in the local and national art scene. I think in these sort of uncertain and trying times, that kind of support really reveals itself as totally crucial and essential. So thanks to Vtape, thanks to you, Lisa, Kim, Kira, everybody involved for setting this up. It's our first go at a live stream, I think, for myself for sure. So we'll do our best and hope to see many of you through the course. I'll invite John on, and I'll let you go, Lisa. So bye-bye.
Okay, so can you see Adam?
I can, but
Yeah, it's not working on the...
I'm still here. Mm-hmm.
So Lisa, I'm just trying to get you off of the stream here. Okay, I think I found it.
Got it?
Yeah.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, John. Can you see me?
Let's see. I'm realizing that I just need to adjust things a little bit. Because
Okay, no problem. Yeah, the ratio changes a little bit.
Is that better? I think that's okay.
Yeah, I think we're both in the same boat here. I need to...
It's a bit of a weird angle, but...
It is, yeah. We'll make it work.
I hope my connection is okay.
Yeah, you're good so far. So I'll kind of just begin by introducing the project and letting our viewers know, if they don't already, that Empty History, this exhibition, began as a result of a year-long research residency at Vtape under the Researcher is Present program. And it really evolved in direct work with the collection, as well as in conversation with various peers, John, of course, included in that. As a group exhibition and an ongoing research project, Empty History is really a way for me to think about an unworking of the narrative conventions of queer history. And as a result of this, a consideration of forms of queer curating that might exist beyond this idea of progress or teleology. So the artists included in the show, as Lisa mentioned, Lucas Michael, Deirdre Logue, and Paul Wong, all offered up works that allowed us to think through forms of what we're calling de-instrumentalized resistance that are not merely interested in repairing the unjust or the uncertain by offering new queer utopias, but in my view, in a more interesting way, they offer performances of worklessness in pursuit of the pleasure in the broken, in the unchanging and in the everyday. So part of what John and I wanted to discuss today was precisely what is at stake in that care for the irreparable as such. And furthermore, a consideration of the aesthetics and the ethics involved in queer solitude, forms of which are really elegantly suggested through the works of these three artists. So, John, I can think of at least several conversations that you and I have had, each staked, throughout the course of the project's development, and today presents us with an opportunity to reflect upon the show nearly 6 months after the opening. Actually, would be more than 6 months. Now, in light of a world in transition, I don't think that any of us could have really predicted. So I wanted to begin by just asking you if you had any thoughts about the relationship between the ideas at work in the exhibition and this idea of a workless practice, the idea of capitalist temporality, specifically in relation to the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, over the last couple of months, as I've been thinking about and have been asked to make comments on the relationship between art and the pandemic, or the place and role of art in the pandemic, I found myself returning to your exhibition, right? And thinking about, as I was at the same time thinking about questions of solitude, distinct from loneliness and isolation, I returned to the exhibition and the three video works, each of which shows a single person doing something in a solitary space, right? And it just struck me that your exhibition was could be a key reference point in thinking not only about particular relations that art might have to the pandemic in general, but also then the ways in which what we're seeing in each of those videos, as you said, kind of performs or presents another way of thinking about solitude. And in terms of a kind of particularly queer solitude, we might take a recent study. It was just the other day that I was reading The Guardian, and they were reporting on a new study that two researchers, one out of the University College London and one out of Sussex University, have done on the effects of the pandemic on members of the LGBTQ population. And what they found was that the effects were incredibly pernicious and negative, right? That the majority of respondents have suffered depression. No less than 90% had experienced some kind of homophobia or transphobia. And this was particularly acute amongst young queers, right? Young queers who suddenly find themselves back at home, feeling completely isolated in homophobic environments, and feeling untethered from their support networks, their friends, their allies, and so forth, right? And so, in reading this report, as I'm thinking about our conversation today about queer solitude, I think this is a perfect way to make clear what we're not talking about, right? Mm-hmm. When we're talking about queer solitude, we're not talking about this. This is the opposite of queer solitude. the opposite of queer solitude are the isolating effects of homophobia and transphobia, and the various kind of closeting domestic contexts and otherwise, right?
Mhm.
That's the opposite of queer solitude. So this neologism has
Mhm.
now come up, which is quarantine, right? The quarantine within the quarantine. And I think there are both positive and negative valences to that term, right? Within the context of this study where they use the term quarantine, I think it can be, it can signal the particular negative effects of quarantine on queers, especially young queers. I think there's another way, a more positive way in which we can think about putting the queer in quarantine, which is what we're interested in, right? A certain kind of queer solitude and perversity that would demonstrate that one could still be queer even in the quarantine, against the kind of forces that so many queers in the pandemic are experiencing, this sort of negative,
Right. Yeah, I think returning to the works in the exhibition, this idea of a workless practice is something that is performed, as you said, in the solitary conditions with which they create. So in some cases that is pointing, in some cases that is balancing, and in others it reveals itself as another kind of domestic obsession. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how this practice reveals itself as a kind of creation of a world without others. And so it might be good in the earlier stages of this talk to just turn to Deleuze's wonderful essay, Michel Tournier and the World Without Others, as a way to think about this idea of queer solitude in relation to perverse ways of being in the world. Do you have any initial thoughts about that essay?
Yeah, so of course, this was one of the other reference points and go-to places for me as I'm thinking about and reading across things and trying to come up with my own way of dealing with the question of solitude. And so Deleuze in 1969 in his novel, in his book, The Logic of Sense, in one of the appendices, writes this essay, includes this essay on Michel Tournier's novel, Vendredi, Friday, or The Other Island, subtitled Or the Other Island. And that novel came out just 2 years before Deleuze publishes his book. And what Tournier is doing in the novel is first of all, he's rewriting the Daniel Defoe Robinson Crusoe story. And part of that rewriting is to foreground Crusoe's companion, Friday, right? So now the title carries his name rather than that of Robinson Crusoe. And right then and there, between that name, which is the other of Robinson Crusoe, and the rest of the title, The Other Island, what Deleuze is interested in is the way in which the other operates here, different from what he calls the structure other, right? Structure other being the kind of writ large way in which all perceptual fields and all senses of possibility get delimited and constrained and so forth, right? And so what he's interested in is exactly that, right? This life on a desert island as living in a world without others, in which solitude is that other island, that is the other side of the island, which would be loneliness or isolation, right? So what Deleuze is interested in is the way in which this becomes a story of an escape from exactly the enclosed, organized, delimited, workable, and merely possible world of others, right? And this is what he is interested in exploring. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to think about that text through the lens of another that we have looked at might reveal something about the exhibition. So if we think about how Logue, Wong, and Michael performed this worklessness as a kind of devotion to care for repetition, and a sort of non-transcendence, we can kind of turn to E. Sedgwick's paranoid reading and reparative reading with a new set of tools in our hands. So one of the things that I was interested in when I was working through the research residency was how these artists aren't interested in reclaiming truths about identity, community, or shared history, but by exposing the legacies of homophobic discourse. This would sort of be described for Sedgwick as a kind of paranoid reading practice. One that is rooted in the assumption that we can only begin to dismantle forms of oppression and domination by first recognizing those historical truths and uncovering them. So reparative reading, on the other hand, would be, to use her words here, a matter of using one's own resources to assemble or repair the murderous part objects into something like a whole. But being aware of the ways in which she is attentive to the transitions that take place between those two positions, I'm reminded of the great many exhibitions that were produced around this time last year in light of the Stonewall 50th anniversary. And just thinking about how those projects were working to reconstruct fragmented queer histories in the name of representation, in the name of inclusion and therefore a kind of recognition, art historically speaking. And one of the things that I was thinking about in preparation for this conversation was just how empty history was never really engaged in that way with the project of reparative visibility. And in this way, it kind of allows us to think about a transition or a move away from the representation of queer actors or representations of queer actions that are so oftentimes adopted in the name of progress, and towards a kind of non-productive, non-teleological queer worklessness, and thinking about how that is something that operates outside the space of progress, or what is traditionally regarded as progressive curating in that queer sense of the term. And so with respect to that kind of worklessness, in reading Deleuze and now a little bit of Sedgwick, I wanted to think about the kinds of political and ethical implications of that turn to a space beyond work, as it's described here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Well, you know, some of the writing that I've done and that I've published during the pandemic has been on worklessness and impotentiality, right? A way in which, with a recession and reduction in workplace work, in a certain kind of return to having a bit more, perhaps, of one's time return to yourself. There was an opportunity, at least, to think about ways of living and doing that weren't entirely beholden to this productivist logic, right? So it was an opportunity to think about life in terms of the sabbatical, right? In terms of the day off, in terms of other ways of doing and living and acting and so forth. And again, I think the works in the exhibition, in their own very kind of simple, one might say, kind of minor or vernacular way, you know, were in relatively playful ways, we're showing some of that, you know. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like the Tournier novel, the three videos, the Logue and Paul Wong and Lucas Michael. I mean, maybe you should describe those three quickly.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile. Yeah. So it's sort of limiting in the platform. We could have shown videos perhaps, but I'm not sure how to do that necessarily. The first work in the exhibition that that one would seem to encounter would be a large video projection of a work by Lucas Michael titled Fixed Kilometer, in which he is simply dragging his index finger across various surfaces in private and in public spaces, all through the recording of his other hand holding some kind of an iPhone or other camera. It's approximately, if not exactly, 1,000 different takes, as an obvious reference to the other Walter de Maria work. Another work in the exhibition, Paul Wong's Perfect Day, in which the artist is seen kind of restlessly searching for a way to bring himself comfort in the midst of a day to himself, and ends up getting into all sorts of trouble or fun, however you describe it. And another work that you're referring to, John, would be Deirdre Logue's Home Office, in which the artist is seen attempting to balance on a pull-out partition of her desk. I believe herself also during a residency, a period of residency. So in each case, the works don't document any kind of transformation or moment of self-realization or overcoming. There's a kind of restless continuity of that performed action, whether it is a matter of tracing one's world with an invisible line, of balancing on a desk that is proving more difficult than may have been thought, and then finally of rushing to create the conditions of this ideal domestic setting in the midst of a kind of hallucination, if you will. Those are the three works. There's also a sculptural work by Lucas Michael, which is in Latin titled "Fortune Favors the Bold," and it is a sculpture. I think a few of the Vtape promotional materials have used this image, but a crushed trophy, warped and sort of deformed on the gallery floor. So the sculpture sits in the middle of the exhibition, the different works surrounding it, and the audio is switching between the different works, providing a kind of quiet space, but more of a meditative area where the viewer would kind of move between these different figures. So those are the works in a very general sense.
Yeah, but even those descriptions, you know, I mean, those works, I think the Paul Wong is the earliest, right?
Yeah, it would be.
That was a number of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
All of them, the point being, all of them were made well before the pandemic and lockdown and quarantine and self-isolation and so forth. And they would be interesting in any at any moment because of what they're presenting. But it's really kind of uncanny. I mean, it almost as though they were prescient about, you know, you were showing them in November, December last year, and within a month or two, the world was at various stages going into this lockdown, and many people were finding themselves at home, and you know, one could imagine that what we see each of the individuals in each of the works doing are things that someone might find themselves doing. You know, home office, which is this play on, right? I mean, yeah, now everyone's at home office. And so what is she doing? She, you know, she's not working. She's now using the desk as some kind of apparatus to deal with body weight and balance and so forth, or let's just hang out all day and take drugs and see what happens, or let's just kind of scan the horizon, you know, and so forth. So, you know, just in a very simple way, they seem to be records of certain kinds of workless activity, ordinary day-to-day, just sort of at home or somewhere, you know, that then kind of suggests, a different, I guess we could call it a different rapport with oneself, with other things, with the day-to-day. And so what I was going to say a moment ago is that as in the novel, in the Tournier novel, the 3 video works in your exhibition also operate, each of them, without a thesis. There's no statement being made of any kind. They do not really feature characters, right? They're really just individuals, these bodies that happen to be in each of these cases that of the artist themselves. And I think they cannot really be said to be scenes of interiority, right? Since the kind of solitude of these kind of singular bodies and subjects is without the structure others, capital others, that we were just talking about. It's kind of these are moments that are in a way free of that structure other. The structure that would mark social difference, and that would provide, as Deleuze says, the margins and the transitions, the strict, you know, that would structurally divide inside from outside, and that would completely organize the perceptual field, right? Like what can be seen, and not just seen, but in terms of all the bodily senses, what can be done, and so forth. So what I see in those works is that largely free of the other structuring of their perceptual fields, right? Including what we're talking about is this paranoia or reparative reassurance. Each of them, I think, seems to be pursuing a kind of mundane adventure, you know, experiments in the body, experiments in bodily perception. They attempt to find out what might happen to a body and its perceptions if that body and its perceptions were not limited to what was merely possible, right? And I think it's that. I think it's the relationship between what we're calling worklessness and as that which is outside the merely possible, which connects these works up with Deleuze, because what Deleuze tells us, I mean, he, of course, more generally, and this is where we start to get into the political questions, right? This is not about the politics or art of the possible. This is a radical critique of such a art or politics of the possible, and thinking beyond mere possibility towards something else, which is really the experimentation and the adventure, and kind of operating without guardrails, without, operating in a perceptual field that hasn't been completely structured and determined in advance. And I think that way of kind of working outside of the merely possible in terms of sensory modalities and perception is the definition of the artist. I mean, that is what any artist does, right? I mean, if artists were limited simply to what could be done, there wouldn't be, I mean, that's sort of the cancellation of the definition of art and aesthetic practice. And so really what I think we see in these works are also, regardless of whether they actually are the artists, and they are, these are, even if they weren't the artists themselves, these are portraits of the artists, right? Each of them is a portrait of that kind of subject figure that is the artist, right? And then what I thought was interesting is that it seemed as a curator, you were taking your cues from those artists and those works and handling those works and placing them alongside each other and making your decisions with an incredible amount of restraint to curate the exhibition in the way that you did, right? And so it seemed it was one of those, great moments in which both the exhibition itself and the work that it features seem to follow the same aesthetic logic, right? That they're doing the same thing, that to the same extent that we can describe the works as operating in this sort of impotentiality and worklessness and such, I think your curating was doing that too.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting results of working with a collection as far as that residency program went. I didn't approach the possibility of creating an exhibition by picking works from the collection to represent an idea that I already had. Part of that process was opening myself up to a kind of absence or void, and letting certain works enter into the research. And as a result of that, I think as you said, the process of curating, the framework of the residency mirrors the works in a really interesting way, because I had to sort of learn about the form or shape that exhibition was going to take through those works, and not the other way around. And so there is certainly a lot to say about curating as a practice and a process in that way. One of the things I wanted to just touch on quickly while we were on Deleuze there was, for viewers who haven't read the essay, I think it's important to note that being in a world without others is not guaranteed by solitude, as we've been saying. It's not guaranteed by being alone. I should probably put it differently. It involves a kind of rethinking and destructuring of one's way of being in the world. and I wanted to just share a few quotes, a very, very few short quotes from the essay, just to kind of frame that idea.
Great.
They have to do with the ways in which Robinson Crusoe begins to face the crumbling of that structure other as he stays longer on the island. So Deleuze writes, pulling himself from a wallowing place, Robinson seeks a substitute for others, something capable of maintaining, in spite of everything, the fold that the others granted to things, namely order and work. And so Robinson then, Deleuze describes him, he throws himself into a kind of state of frenetic production, but also, quote, in line with this activity, and as a necessary correlate to it, a strange passion for relaxation and sexuality is developed. And then in one of my favorite passages from the text, Deleuze writes, as Robinson inches closer to this kind of workless existence on the island, he, quote, enters into a state of regression much more fantastic than the regression of neuroses, whereas work used to conserve the form of objects as so many accumulated vestiges, involution gives up every formed object for the sake of an inside of the earth and the principle of burying things in it. And so with those different passages, I'm tempted, as we've been saying, to think about this scene of Robinson's fantastic regression in relation to or as the scene of the three artists' performances of worklessness. And one of the things that Deleuze says in the beginning of the essay is simply that this being in a world without others is not merely a matter of space, of being without somebody there. It is also a matter of time and temporality. And so I think we can also begin to think about this fantastic regression or worklessness as a kind of salvation, as Deleuze would put it, or in different terms, a process of unlearning of that oftentimes comforting yet ultimately brutal logic of capitalist temporality, which I think the artists in the exhibition figure as that kind of realm of the possible, which the structure other lends to them. And so with that being said, maybe we can think about this idea of perverse worklessness, perverse being in the world, or being without others, through the lens of curating as a practice more specifically. Do you have any thoughts on the practice of curating through that lens of a workless existence?
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, I would say again, to draw even further from Deleuze, I mean, why is it that he describes Crusoe in the novel as perverse, right? He says it's because he is, in a way, wholly oriented towards ends, but only to the extent that they provide the means to deviate from those ends, right? And that's what's interesting, right? So he sees it not as a story that is caught up in questions of origin, right? But instead as indeed still, attuned to and kind of committed to some idea of an end, but only to the extent that it ends up being the opportunity to deviate. And it's that deviance from the end, that productive end, that in particular, that aim, that right, that objective, that sense of fulfillment and completion, that Deleuze says that's what's perverse, right? Mm-hmm. That's what makes the character particularly perverse. And so I think what, in terms of curating, like any aesthetic practice project, right? It may be a matter of, along these lines, of thinking exactly about, you had an exhibition to mount. There was going to be an end. There was going to be something put up and presented. But if you can use that as an opportunity to deviate from, I don't know, whatever form the end might take, such as, in terms of a thematic, or in terms of any other kind of recognizable, identifying means by which, right, that basically what we're talking about is the way in which, when we're talking about this structure other, this other structuring, we're talking about the way in which it doesn't allow for that deviation from the end, right? It is so end oriented. In fact, the end, as you were suggesting, is already there. It's already determined, right? And that's why it ends up being simply a matter of the possible, in the sense that that's already been preordained. It then constrains, delimits, defines what is possible, because it already has, it has already delimited that. And then you just have to kind of fill it in, right? And so I think sometimes what the least interesting curatorial projects will do is they will set up that structure and then just try to fill it with content. And what you were saying is, through the residency, it became a means, an opportunity for you to do research, right? And for you to find works that would not necessarily, kind of add up to anything, although in fact they do. I mean, we can talk about this, as we have been, we can talk about the three of them together. I mean, it was an incredibly coherent exhibition. Do you have further thoughts on?
I know it's a big question. I mean, I sort of posed it quickly, but I appreciate the patience with which you're getting to it. I mean, I think that one of the ways that I've been thinking about curating in light of the research that was conducted through that residency, in light of the two readings that we're referencing here, is just exactly as you said, the sort of temporal dimensions of a curatorial practice that is not searching for or in pursuit of a kind of completion or end result, but one that is defined by a kind of non-arrival, and a non-arrival that is always already guaranteed. Part of the idea behind Empty History Project is that it's ongoing as well. There's no saying that exhibition is the end result of that project, but in a different sense, as we were saying before, the works in the show, or we were suggesting before, the works in the show themselves frame kind of minor curatorial practices, not in the conventional sense of producing an exhibition or inviting a public to view your opening or whatever it might be, but to think about how these works stage an organizing of the world in pursuit of that worklessness, a kind of endless pursuit of something that will not reveal itself. And in all of the works on display, there is no real sense of finality. There's no telling, for example, when the subject in Deirdre Logue's home office gets off the desk from trying to balance on it, that she won't just go back and do it again. Or that the subject in Paul Wong's video wouldn't the next day do the same thing, or that Lucas Michael's project is simply finished when there are 1,000 takes of that fixed kilometer or broken kilometer. And in that sense, I wanted to think about that pursuit as a kind of framing of time, or a frameless time, in relation to the order of that structure other that Deleuze describes.
I mean, I think one of the ways you did that was simply by limiting the works to those three and including all three, each of which basically reinforces and in a certain sense replicates the others, and so there's a way in which you by choosing those three, each of which has this individual subject engage in this kind of workless work, there's a kind of relentlessness that gets accumulated, and that one can't ever find kind of that place of resolve, or you know, or that sense of finish. That instead, it's not as though any one of the works is going to be the key to the exhibition or to the others. It's not as though, you know, they kind of both mutually support each other and don't add up to anything in particular, you know.
Yeah.
And I think the crushed trophy is a funny kind of, right, sitting there in the middle of the gallery. That's kind of, you know, yeah, that's the kind of award you receive for doing this kind of work, right? It's just this kind of deflated, deflated trophy cup, right? Which is great as the object, which may be the one thing that, you know, does kind of tie them all together, each,
I think so, yeah.
Without it really being bestowed upon any of them. Everyone's a winner, no one's a winner, or something. So,
yeah. But the one thing you said there is worth emphasizing, which is the work of that worklessness. It's oftentimes figured that if that sort of a term would suggest the absence of any kind of activity. In the case of these works, it does involve it involves a real work, a kind of restless continuity, as we've been saying. But one of the things that motivates this work, if there is any motivation at all, in my view, is that recognition that the world is not so easily repaired through processes of accumulation, of overcoming, so on and so forth. And this recognition results in a kind of care for the irreparable, I would say, that each of these works demonstrate in their own way. There is certainly a care for that could be described as a kind of discipline of the mind and of the body, really. A discipline that is perverse, as we've been saying, insofar as it can't be reduced into that logic of capitalist temporality, of the time frame or the timeline of progress, or in the more general sense of the term, one that can't be assimilated into the order of the structure other, as Deleuze puts it. And it's that care for the irreparable that I think takes us back to the question of curating, a kind of queer curating that is not about, as we've said, accumulation or a determinate structure, but one that is about, or one that is operating in pursuit of a kind of illegible, indeterminate, or empty history, if you like. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about curating as a care for the irreparable, because I know that's a lot of your work has been thinking through that idea of irreparability.
yeah. Well, maybe we should talk about what we think that word means. What is what is this irreparable? What does that mean? Because it can, I mean, first of all, what is the irreparable? What do we mean by that? And how should that not be confused with other things with which it's often easily confused?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think when we talk about the irreparable, we talk about, I mean, the irreparable literally means that which either is cannot be repaired, right, or need not be repaired, right? And it's in the sense of need not be repaired that you often run into trouble with those who then think that what you're saying is, oh, this is just an apology for the status quo and being complicit with the way things are, and thinking that what you're saying is everything is perfect and fine and nothing needs to change. Mm-hmm. So that's not what the irreparable, this sort of politics and ethics of the irreparable is about. Certainly not, quite the contrary. But what it is it's not falling into what Sedgwick, the other author that we've turned to over the last couple months, and in particular her essay on paranoid and reparative reading, right, points out, which is that, you know, the paranoid reading practice, which is an intensification of what has been referred to as the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? That kind of always suspicious, skeptical, radically skeptical, and critical way of reading. What we would want to say is that what we've been talking about in terms of the perversity of queer solitude and the way in which that perversity relates to the irreparable is that it opens up space between these two prevailing means of reading, or we could simply say relating to others in the world, right? In a paranoid way or in a reparative way, right? And the reparative is at least a little bit more positive than the paranoid, right? It's a little bit more palatable. The reparative is about, as she says, a kind of the contingency of desire. That is, it's still within this sort of thing about relations between subjects and objects. What we're trying to do in thinking about the irreparable is to move even outside of the reparative, right? And the contingency of desire, because as Deleuze says, what desire does is operate through this other structure, right? And so the irreparable is going to stand in between this paranoid and this reparative way of kind of reading or relating or being in rapport. I mean, what is paranoia? Paranoia, again, following Sedgwick, is an aversion to surprise, right? It is a very rigid temporality, right? Of being at once retroactive and anticipatory, right? One is paranoid always about that which is about to happen based upon some sense of the past. So one is in the future, always past, in the sense of like always already guilty, always already humiliated, right? And that becomes this very kind of prejudicial, right, way of reading the world, right? At one point, she refers to it as vigilant scanning, right? And I couldn't help but think about Lucas Michael and what he's doing there with this, right? That is not vigilant scanning, right? That is not this kind of looking, suspecting in this paranoid way and kind of scanning the world for those moments. And so instead of either the paranoid or the reparative, right, we've got this other thing that we're talking about. So instead of the structure other, we're talking about a perverse structure, right? Which is one that would be living in the world with not others, but otherwise others, like, as Deleuze says, truly concrete others, like not just some phantasmatic meta other. And in that regard, those otherwise others are always going to be anonymous, promiscuous, clandestine, right? And in fact, he himself says, so perverse that they're even beyond voyeurism and exhibitionism, right? So that completely bears upon the world of art and visuality and visibility and curating, right? Because we're not even talking about voyeurism and exhibitionism, because as Sedgwick herself says, often being made visible is its own form of violence. And so what just as much as being made invisible can be, but these things are not so easily mapped politically or ethically, right? And so, yeah, so, and maybe I should let you.
Well, I think you're making some great points that I think are really tying in the conversation from before as well. One thing that I would add just quickly is the way that I've been thinking about a non-reparative curatorial practice is one that is based upon or interested in a kind of withdrawal from that that conventional formula of queer curating that is based on reparative visibility, that is based on a kind of incessant inclusion into the art historical canon. And I think that that process of withdrawal or retreat is something that we are certainly interested in when we think about the irreparable, not as a complicity, as you mentioned, but as a refusal to partake in a structure that that is so oftentimes interested in the breaking apart of the individual, of just degradation and dispossession. And so that would be what I have to add. I'm seeing up here we have about a minute left on our live stream, so maybe we can have some closing remarks from you, John, and then I can tie things up.
Yeah, I don't know. Closing remarks. I guess I would say that, well, let's just bring it into the current contemporary political context. I don't know if this is exactly the best place for us to end, but, there is these days a paranoid consensus that is a way in which the left and the right find themselves strangely proximate to each other, right? To the extent that each of them operates with a certain incredible paranoia, right? This is, I think, what has led to a certain kind of political stasis or civil war, in quotes, For instance, mutual accusations on both sides about the deep state, right?
Hi again.
We're live again.
We're live again. I figured that I just got the prompt that we had an hour only, and so I was seeing things tick down. But I think we should end our talk with your thoughts there. So at least we can have the two recordings continued.
Well, I think it's a bit of an odd ending, I suppose, but
yeah,
I mean, it was about this idea that, today, politically speaking, the left and the right share in a kind of paranoid consensus, and that this is not really, from at least a leftist point of view, not a particularly effective way of going about doing things, especially when exactly one finds oneself so proximate to the right when it comes to, as I was saying, mutual accusations about the deep state, right? Accusations from both sides about the other and the other's systemic violence, that there are terrorists on both sides, right? This kind of thing,
Mhm.
in which, you know what I mean? Like this way in which it's the Antifa, you know, and the Boogaloo Boy, and it's sort of this, you know, and these throwing these accusations around, and then of course about elections that are either about, you know, disenfranchising voters and foreign meddling. These are the accusations of the left, the paranoid, and then cries of voter fraud and rigging on the part of the right, including Trump. You know, so there's just this way in which we're in this incredible moment of paranoid politics, and you know, I mean, it's just an observation. I don't know if I have anything to say about how exactly, except that there may be another way that is not so paranoid in its reading and in its you know.
Yeah, it certainly seems that the non-reparative offers us a way to think beyond that division between paranoia and the reparative, specifically in the realm of queer curating. I don't know if there's any other topics you wanted to touch on now that we have a little bit longer, or we can sign off here and.
Yeah, just to say that those two things, what we're calling, you know, what Sedgwick points out as the paranoid and the reparative, they work hand in hand, right? And so maybe it is this constant oscillating rhythm. And so you find as the pendulum swings one way, it eventually will start to swing the other way. And if we're often so completely enticed and seduced by the reparative approach, we know that with that, you know, I mean, the point might be, those were the Obama years, right? The reparative years. And now we're in the paranoid years. And then we're trying to now say, oh, we need to get back to a more, you know, we have to repair. And this kind of oscillation back and forth is actually the way in which the status quo is maintained. Right? So that's the thing to point out, that a commitment to the irreparable is a commitment to refusing this two-part back and forth rhythm of the paranoid and the reparative, which actually is the motor together, those two things, right? That becomes the structure and motor for the maintenance of the status quo. And as we're saying, in terms of the current political paranoid consensus, a certain kind of gridlock, a certain kind of stasis, a certain kind of civil war, right? And so we're all the more in need of something else, an alternative to either of these. And I think what Deleuze is doing, and in that essay, and what others, including in particular, we haven't talked about him, but he's been kind of hovering in the back of our minds, is Giorgio Agamben and his work on the irreparable and impotentiality. So, but that would be part of a longer conversation, which I guess to end, we could say we hope to do that. This is, I think, our third or fourth public conversation. And it's always great to talk to you. And that we even have hopes for maybe in the next year doing a kind of mini seminar or school around some of this that people could sign up for and participate in, which could be fun. So
yeah, certainly if there's anybody who is watching currently or from the previous stream, we'll have these on Vtape's channel. If there's anybody from those streams that has interest in these ideas, definitely reach out to John or I, and we'll think about forms of collaboration that might reveal themselves in the future. Who knows? I mean, we're kind of we're excited to explore these ideas publicly, but otherwise they would be, I suppose, a Zoom call anyways. So it's right. Just as well. Well, thank you, John. That was great.
Yeah, thank you too.
I'm gonna end the video now, but
okay.
always great having you.
Great. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.